Hello and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. This episode is the first update of 2021 in our long-standing Expert Insight series on cyber threats and securities, where we invite security experts to share their views and knowledge, their insights, on network intrusion and security generally and in the Caribbean region. Today's guest is no stranger to our Expert Insight series. We are thrilled to welcome back Sean Slattery, who is the founder and chief technology officer of Caribbean Solutions Lab, a cybersecurity service provider that helps businesses throughout the Caribbean and North America defend and protect themselves from cyber threats. Sean is based in the Cayman Islands and has spent over a decade focusing primarily on cybersecurity and has been closely affiliated with global security company McAfee. Sean, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back.
Okay, so just to give us a start, can we just get a quick recap of what has been going on in the Caribbean region with regard to cybersecurity threats and incidents?
I think there are a couple obvious gorillas in the room, as they say. Obviously, COVID-19, the pandemic, I think that changed a lot of things for everyone. And I think the Caribbean is an interesting region because we've not always embraced the concept of working from home. We're pros at it now, I think, for the most part, for the world, almost a year on. So I think it was our last podcast was, I think, weeks, if not less, before the start of the big pandemic in the Western Hemisphere. And COVID. I mean, that was a big challenge. I know of many organizations that didn't have work from home, work from the road or anywhere. Procedures and policies in place. So many were scrambling just to set up the infrastructure to handle that. And of course, with that new infrastructure and the sudden requirement to work remotely during curfews and lockdowns and all that, there are obvious concerns and risks around the security of that. Cyber criminals are always quick to capitalize on news and current events, and we were tracking through just one of our threat intelligence feeds, malicious URLs and domains associated with COVID, fake COVID information, sometimes real information. We were tracking, there were, at the beginning of the pandemic, I think there was an average growth of 10,000 new fake domains a month. The URLs were typically 3-4 times greater than that. It's hard to keep track, and that's just one source of community threat sharing that we came across. That seems to have stabilized now. I think we're hovering around 120,000 fake domains that change each month, give or take, or each period. Let's see what else. From COVID-19, of course, there was a moratorium early on by the criminal underground about not attacking healthcare, because obviously, they recognized that it was important for people to be physically safe. But that didn't last long. Despite the moratorium on that, it was only a couple months before hospitals started getting attacked with ransomware. So much for honor amongst thieves. And now, more recently, there's a lot of threats around vaccines and espionage and trying to steal it, and that's going all over the world. You see these events all over the world. And of course, I think the other funny thing that hit the Caribbean for a lot of organizations was the implementation of new compliance and governance frameworks. So right in the middle of the pandemic, several governments started requiring or announced formal implementation of, typically in this space, compliance frameworks. So all of a sudden, amongst everything else, that caught a lot of organizations, I won't say off guard, but they knew it was coming. Just no one, I think, quite expected it to happen at the same time as a pandemic. But such is life, and life does go on, and you deal with it. And I think that the last big thing I can think of is, of course, the SolarWinds breach that was announced by FireEye late last year, and that's had massive repercussions across the world, but as well as the Caribbean. So SolarWinds or FireEye announced a breach. Just to recap, if anyone missed the news. FireEye, global security company, very well-known incident response team and all that, announced that they were breached in early December, I believe it was. And they they started sharing information about it. It quickly came about that it was SolarWinds Orion network management software that appeared to be the source of their breach. Investigations ensued, and it turned out later on that Microsoft Office 365 accounts were also compromised. And then shortly thereafter, it became apparent that there were several hundred, if not thousand, companies around the world, including several organizations we know directly in the Caribbean, that were impacted by it and named in some of the disclosure documents about risks and all that. And then since then, it's a great example of supply chain compromise, right? So SolarWinds supplied technology to lots of other companies, and they were one of the main vectors that allowed the criminals to get into the various organizations. And since then, even into this year, we've seen Mimecast, SonicWall, Malwarebytes, Emisoft. I've actually kind of lost track of some of the security technology and security companies that have since announced breaches of their own infrastructure. So that's a big one, because all of a sudden we expected now SolarWinds isn't a security company, but FireEye, Microsoft has a lot of security infrastructure. I named a bunch of those security companies. Now to think that your security suppliers are at risk, it starts to change the way you think about security. So it's an interesting time, but not one that's hopeless by any means. There's a lot of things we can learn from all this, of course.
Indeed. Yes, I mean, I'm still just coming to grips with all of what has transpired. I mean, you're mentioning about, the malicious URL and feeds, and 120,000, 100,000+ per, whether it's per month or I guess within the reporting period. And that is just, significant. And if that is what one is observing on, let's say, a monthly basis or within the reporting period, it just shows you how intense and huge the effort and the threats are to compromise our digital security.
Yes, indeed.
So that I think is something I'm just sort of still grappling with based on just all of that information that you've shared. But just going back to just the working from home context, because or the remote working and as you say, working from the road. I mean, what are some of the threats to which we could be subject? I think some of us might have been aware, like for example, there was a time when Zoom had been compromised and there were some vulnerabilities that I think the company has since corrected. But I think still there ought to be some just concerns since one is using this sort of digital channel through which to do probably a lot of business these days.
Very true. So Zoom was an interesting one. They for years, you've been in the industry long enough. The real names for remote meetings and all that was WebEx and GoToMeeting and there were a few others, of course. But it's funny that Zoom did such a great job with the user interface. It made it so that everyone could use it. I mean, we've had family use it. We've had, and the problem was, you see it so often in technology where they build a tool. No, I have no complaints against Zoom. They made a very convenient, easy to use tool, but made some shortcuts with terms of thinking about security. Right? Their goal was to make video conferencing and meetings very easy. They did, and I think some of those, I won't say shortcuts. I mean, it's perhaps the wrong word, but omissions, just oversights, because they're focused. They're not security people. They were, building meetings. Those things like lack of password protection meetings, the ability, the ability to quickly share meeting links via social media is what got them. But I think in the end of the day, there weren't any. Yes, there were some obscene things and Zoom bombings that happened in various school meetings and all that. I don't want to diminish those problems, but I think the world learned from their mistakes, and I think that's always the case. You notice now that Zoom has, I think most meetings, Microsoft Teams as well, they have the ability to admit to quarantine attendees so that someone has to explicitly allow them into the meeting. And that generally works, although there's still some cases where it's hard to vet a meeting of 500 people, and if you're struggling to get started, that's just life, right? If you need to get a meeting started on time, and there's 500 people, and all of a sudden 30 join at the last minute, well, you're probably going to admit them all in one go, and that's just part of the learning curve, and that we're all figuring out. That was just one aspect. I think probably the most public aspect of the work from home efforts and problems that ensued from that. On the pure cybersecurity side, mentioned earlier, I think before we started, I was mentioning that a lot of organizations were just struggling with didn't have working from home procedures, policies, infrastructure in place ahead of time. So we know of several that all of a sudden had to ramp up. And in the one case, some organizations were able to set up laptops or actually purchase computers for their staff. That's obviously an ideal setup because they have full control. They've got their management, their security policies and all that in place. But many, I would say probably most, weren't prepared for that. And a lot of organizations were forced to allow users, and staff to use their own home computers. And of course, they're the staff's home computers. They don't have necessarily the same cybersecurity tools, endpoint security, network security, things in place. And that was an acceptable risk at the time because it was either that or don't function. So everything that can happen there. And of course, at some point, phishing and all that continues. Fake URLs, looking for the latest video. The employee's home computer, for example, didn't have the necessary Zoom tools. Well, they had to go and search the internet to get the Zoom link or the WebEx or whatever it is. And like we've seen for years, often they get redirected to fake Zoom plugins, and I'm picking on Zoom. And disclaimer, I'm not just picking on Zoom. I'm just saying whatever the tool at hand, whether it be instant messenger or whatnot. I think that was a real problem that a large organization faced as well. And at the end of the day, if you can compromise, as long as you recognize that the employee's home computer is now part of the infrastructure, and if you understand that from a cybersecurity defense perspective, that's great. But recognize that, of course, the cyber criminals see that as a huge opportunity, to send those emails. An employee at home might be more distracted by something happening in the background, trying to take care of the dog, the child, the spouse, whatever's happening, might get distracted and click that link after all. And I think there's plenty of statistics that have shown that there's been a large increase in phishing and threats and all that during the work from home efforts. And I think I say during, but I don't want to say it in past tense, but it's obviously still going on. I mean, we're following that. Most of our organizations we work with outside some of the more locked down islands are working from home still. So, and I know a lot of people in the U.S. that are still working from home, working from anywhere, and that's just it's likely to stay for a while longer. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of threats. It's just now, like I said, just understand that work from home infrastructure is now part of your company, for better, for worse.
Indeed. That's so true. And I guess certainly, I mean, even after the pandemic, should we get to a point where it is safe for us to go back to work, there may be questions as to whether or not, to the extent to which organizations will require all of their staff to be on site all the time. So one may find that work from home or work from anywhere becomes the norm, at least as part of the different modalities that are permitted within organizations. But having said that, I mean, how might users and even their employers reduce the chance of a successful breach from the perspective that, as you said, they're working from home, there may be all kinds of distractions, they're using their personal devices. It's oftentimes that it's, employees or people internal to organizations that foster the greatest threat. So I'm thinking just in terms of perhaps maybe from the small and medium-sized enterprises, which may not necessarily have the resources of, large corporates and the teams that those entities can access. How might they be able to reduce the chance of a successful breach?
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned earlier that, in an ideal case, the organization, the company could provide the necessary equipment, computers, laptops, infrastructure, and all that. And we know of one hand, at one extreme, the companies just couldn't. And so staff were using their own computers. On the other hand, we know of some that kind of parallels the whole hurricane preparedness, the DR that, we all are facing in the Caribbean. One organization we know went completely. They just accepted the cost, the write-off of all the desktop infrastructure they replaced beginning of last year, before the pandemic, and switched everyone to laptops. And so now, on the one hand, you can fully embrace the cloud or working remotely, and that helps with DR plans, which it's useful. So it's not just a write-off. You're addressing the disaster recovery concerns at the same time, of course. But I'd say that the education, of course, is always important, and you can't forget that user awareness. You can do security awareness testing, training, phishing testing, things like that. Those are always important. I think most compliance and cybersecurity frameworks require that. But as I mentioned earlier, if you start realizing that those employee-owned devices are part of that infrastructure, you can know one way is, of course, basic endpoint security. Most vendors have work from home. Well, early on, they had lots of promotionals, of course, but most security vendors have employee home use options. Microsoft has it with licensing, for example. So, if you have, and I haven't done Microsoft licensing in a while, but if you had X number of enterprise or corporate licenses, you're allowed, because the employee's not using it at work, to install it at home. So there are certain things that make the standardization of tools important. So, for example, if you're standardized on Office 2019, I think is the current version. I've lost track these days. But then you wouldn't necessarily want an employee trying to use an old, really, potentially pirated or really old version because of the risks of patching and all that. So, that might be a good option for a lot of organizations to use. Look for home use options. And what you can do then is, once you've got some level of standardization with the environment, you can start implementing certain controls. So multi-factor authentication is still important. Identity management is still important. If you think about, if you go back to the SolarWinds breach with Microsoft and many departments and divisions within the U.S. government, a lot of the breaches were discovered to be linked to their Office 365 accounts through identity theft, single sign-on, things like that, just exploiting not vulnerabilities in the sense of a flaw in the application, but just leveraging the way the infrastructure was made to be convenient for the user. So if a user signed on once and got it everywhere, well, they compromised that single sign-on system and were able to access all the users' information. So identity management's a huge thing. And so in the work from home, you can implement, typically, if you've got 20% of your office that might truly need to work from home, then you don't need to spend on, 200 licenses. You can probably get by with, say, 20 licenses, or whatever the math is. But with those multi-factor checks, you can do additional things like before, so to explain multi-factor, in case the listeners haven't come across it, you typically log in with the username and password. Multi-factor is a system that allows you to check for typically something else, like a code texted to their phone, or a code generated on their phone or iPad or something like that, or possibly an extra security key that they have to plug in to USB drive. So the idea being is, even if someone compromises, steals, you lose your password, a criminal cannot log on without having that extra factor. But what you can do with most multi-factor tools is check the system logging in. So if, for example, one of the things we require is, if we're going to log into our own systems or customer systems, we ensure that the system's up to date. It's got the latest antivirus endpoint security tools, and they're actually running. Disk encryption is fully turned on. The firewall's turned on. We don't have bad. We're not connecting via anonymizing tools like Tor. We can check to see that you're not connecting from undesirable locations. For example, if you expect your staff to be in Cayman or Grenada or Jamaica, well, you can probably block access from Russia, and I'm just arbitrarily picking on Russia, right? So you can do a lot of things there to improve security without necessarily breaking the bank or making it too onerous for the users as well. And those are things that can apply to both employee and corporate-owned devices. Those are probably the big things I would choose, without going crazy on requiring patching and full management of a staff member's home computer.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, because clearly I think there just has to be certainly a heightened understanding of the fact that, you have to put in certain measures, and it can no longer just be about expediency, but, security. The fact that, for example, with something like multi-factor authentication, that in addition to having a password, which, let's say you put it in like one of these password managers, so it might automatically log in, but you still need another step to
True,
ensure
true.
that you who is accessing is authorized to do so. But you had mentioned cloud, and the whole issue, I think, especially again with what transpired last year, or at least what is continuing from last year, whereby we have perhaps, in addition to probably people working remotely, and I guess if their offices, for example, don't have very sophisticated networks and so on, they may be using various cloud options with which to facilitate the work of the organization. And I would think, though, that there probably have been some vulnerabilities that have emerged, or some things that were probably cloud has had to be given more attention. So I don't know if there are any sort of threats or so on that have become more evident in cloud-based services.
I'm actually glad you brought that up. It's actually something interesting we've observed over time, but I think more recently, a lot since the pandemic started, is the Caribbean's acceptance of cloud services. I think for the longest time, of course, in the islands we had to be independent because telco cost an arm and a leg and a firstborn. But as those prices came down over time, our reliance and use and acceptance of global communications grew, of course. But there was always a concern over security and stability of our, not so much of the cloud, but say our internet connections, because as just like most islands, we've got a limited amount of bandwidth. We've got typically a couple physical cables that we know where they are, and they run off the islands. And if a backhoe cuts it by accident, well, we all suffer. But the pandemic, I think, changed a lot, and I think enabled a lot of organizations to rapidly ramp up. That's the benefit of cloud, right? The infrastructure. But what's interesting is, while we've been seeing an increase in cloud adoption acceptance, of course, as you say, there are caveats. And one thing that I would say it's a global one thing that happened last year is, of course, the global outages that hit Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Office 365, and even Google late last year, where there were massive issues with availability, authentication. So despite the global ramp up, and none of these were, that I'm aware of, were security issues. They were just infrastructure change control. But it did also highlight our the increasing usage dependence on the cloud has its challenges too. What if if you went completely cloud based, what if Office 365 went down? Would you be able to send your mails? Do you have a backup? I've actually discussed this with a few companies that have gone completely cloud, and they say it's, out of all the risks to handle, that's the least likely to cause a major issue. They're more likely to have a catastrophic plumbing leak in their building, or a hurricane impact the island, or a backhoe cut a line, than to have a massive issue with, say, Microsoft or Google or Amazon or something like that. But of course, on the cyber side, I mentioned earlier about how Microsoft Office 365 was a vector for a lot of credential theft. I mean, it's the tried and true. It's identity management. I think that's probably the biggest threat to cloud computing right now, other than availability, other than a network being taken down or something like that, is control your credentials. Make sure you have multi-factor authentication turned on for all your cloud services. Despite the convenience of doing single sign-on, we use it. I mean, don't get me wrong. Just be conscious and be aware of the risks of making things very, very convenient. I was reading recently that obviously I follow a lot of cybersecurity news, but and it reminded me that so many tools and apps and things like that in the past, let's say 5-10 years, said, oh, just sign up for this new service for a coupon for whatever online shopping. Just sign in using Facebook. And of course, we've learned since then that that's probably not a good thing to do, between privacy concerns around the whole WhatsApp debate and Facebook's privacy policies, but as well as if you lose your Facebook credentials, that's not just social media anymore. That's a lot of other things like shopping and banking, things like that. So as far as cloud goes, yeah, I'd say the big threat for me is identity management. And you mentioned password managers. That's a great thing. That's another good thing that staff can use and should be using at home personally as well. I mean, no one wants to type a 16-character password constantly. I mean, I don't. What do I type? I think I type a 14, but that's my master password. It's a long one, and that unlocks everything for me. And it's just so much easier to manage all my, all the systems. We did a cybersecurity awareness talk with a consultant a while back with a customer, and I was just curious talking about password managers. And I looked up. I think I have over 450 credentials in my password manager, and I think about 25% are things I use on a, let's say, weekly basis. And I was actually shocked when I finally started checking how much I use. But yeah, so it's as far as cloud goes and all the services, don't save passwords in your browsers. Use a password manager, and it comes back down to turn on MFA whenever possible. It really does work. And do monitor. I would say last thing on that was do monitor those alerts. Do pay attention. If they say, hey, you've just signed in from, we've seen a suspicious sign in from Malaysia, again, arbitrary location, you might want to look at that. And it's, if they can use it to target the U.S. Department of Justice, believe me, they can target, a small business in the Caribbean as well. And to them, it makes no difference. It's just, and they don't have to, the cyber criminals, don't have to use it right away. They odds are they'll focus on the big fish initially, but sooner or later when they get tired, they get kicked out of those networks. They'll come back down to any organization they think has value and can be leveraged for whether it be direct compromise, stealing money, or using it to compromise a partner ecosystem or a vendor ecosystem. It's all interlinked. It doesn't really matter. Ultimately, you're online, you're a target. It's just a matter of when they might use that information.
That's so true. I mean, as you mentioned, password managers as well, and as you're talking, I guess just a point I want to emphasize to our listeners is just the importance of using unique passwords. Because it's all well and good that you have a password manager, but if you have 10 sites that use the same password, and yes, it might be 14 characters or 16 characters, that in and of itself, it just increases the sort of vulnerability of those sites that you access. So, I mean, one of the benefits of having a password manager is that you can afford to have unique passwords for every site that you need to have some sort of access control without necessarily having to memorize them. So it is just something really to consider.
Yeah, very true. Interesting stat about passwords is historically, I think we go back, 10 years ago, 8 characters was enough. Then it kind of grew. Then they say make it complex. So put an exclamation at the end, right? We all did it. And one thing talking about the cloud is, many people don't realize it, but the cloud is leveraged by criminals just as much as it is by legitimate businesses. And one of the things you can do is for pennies is literally spool up 100, 500, 1,000 Amazon virtual instances of password crackers, computational. When you work with a cloud provider like Amazon, you're paying for their massive infrastructure of CPUs and memory, and that you can spool up to run code. Well, to spool up 1,000 computers to brute force passwords costs dollars. So to computationally brute force a 12 character password is nothing. Mm-hmm. Now, the moment you start reaching above 14, it starts to get a bit more expensive. And the idea being there is if you made it that difficult for them, beyond 14 characters, 16 is kind of my rule of thumb now, that you make yourself less of a target. But just I think on password manager is great. Just do set them to be as complex as possible. Again, you're not managing them directly. As you say, you want to use unique separate passwords for every service, but recognize the cloud is just a tool, and the criminals use it just as much as we do. And just recognize that it is trivial to brute force a password these days. Under, let's say, 14 characters. 12 is kind of the minimum, but I'd say at least 14. And the funny thing is, of course, is I routinely run across organizations that, including some security ones, that will actually complain that my passwords are too complex. So I've come across that a few times, like, you need to use fewer special characters. Like, well, gee, thanks, you're a security company. And I've come across a few security companies that don't make multi-factor authentication, I won't say easy, but they actually limit you on who you can use. One of the big common ones is Duo, owned by Cisco now. That's one of the most popular ones out there. And if you start when a security company restricts who you can use, the catch-22 is, of course, they're making their environments and now their security vendor, and they're supplying. They have access to the infrastructure of many, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of global companies. I just find that kind of strange at times, that a security company makes it act. They only allow a very small set of tools for strong authentication. But when we see these things, we do file, I won't say grievances, but we do make recommendations. We raise it, and hopefully over time they get these are addressed before something truly bad happens. But it is something we do see, which is just kind of funny if you think about it.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, sort of paradoxical.
Yes.
Right. Well, just one more question on cloud, because you sort of touched on it, and I was thinking about it because, especially for probably SMEs in particular, whereby one might be using a lot of free cloud services, and I wanted to know whether or not there might be any inherent, whether or not vulnerabilities, like sometimes you may have paid services, and we tend to only take the free ones even as a
Right.
business, and whether or not I mean, I guess certainly there may be truth to the adage, you get what you pay for, but I just wanted to get your thoughts from a security perspective. Would that be the case?
From I'll say a direct security perspective, I've not come across anything significant. We see a mix of free, freemium, and paid tools out there in the security space. I think generally these days, at least with the major vendors we work with, there is no difference from a functionality perspective. They may be limited in number of connections you might support or users or something like that. I think the bigger risk with free services, though, is if something goes wrong. And this, from a support perspective, I'm not necessarily talking about a security incident, but what if your credentials are stolen? Let's pick on something easy like Gmail, right? I use Gmail. That's a good email service. It's very reliable, and it's so easy to sign up for a free account and think you're good. But if you start tying it to your banking or online shopping, and you ever lose that, if you don't have a paid subscription, it becomes very, very hard to prove to the vendor, Gmail in this case, that you are who you say you are. Even celebrities, there's plenty of anecdotal stories of celebrities losing access to their social media account or something like that, and having to go through massive ordeals to prove who they are, even though everyone knows this is celebrity X. So one thing there is there's nothing necessarily wrong with free, but do plan to invest in even a basic subscription over time. So in my case, with my Gmail, for example, I only have it tied to my online shopping. I separate my accounts. That's another story. But so my online shopping, I pay for a small, I think it's Google One. So I pay an extra $2 a month. I get 100 gigabytes of storage space. So it also is useful for my backing up my images. But if I ever lose access to my account, I do have MFA turned on. So I have all that turned on anyway. But even if I were to lose access through identity theft or simple, they compromised Google, for example, I would still be able to prove who I am, and through the the financial trail, the paper trail of the credit cards, I'd be able to retain that. I think that applies to almost everything. But the big thing is, from a business perspective, I guess, is the supportability. And most freemium programs do not give you the level of support that you would have with a higher tier. And that's just something that your organization, you're obviously juggling, hundreds of different things at any given time, and just factor that into your risk. And if it's something that's key to your email, for example, you might want to put that at a higher priority and spend the money on that than some other thing that's vying for your attention and your money in that sense. But that's as you say, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and you just have to be conscious of that risk. And like I said, it's not necessarily cyber related. It just could be from support. If you lose access to that free service that's managing your website, and during a hurricane, you might have some problems putting a new notice up, saying that you're down and please contact you via this mechanism during the hurricane, something like that. So different aspects of that one.
Okay. And just switching gears a little bit, And I think, as a, security professional, you're a contractor, you're working with various clients, did you observe any changes in the roles or functions of, IT cybersecurity personnel over the past year? So specifically probably being triggered by the pandemic.
That's a good one. That was an interesting one too. There aren't many of us pure cybersecurity in the region, but there are a lot of people that do have cybersecurity on their business card, or they wear that hat as part of their day-to-day business. One thing that struck me odd, and we were on a call in Miami early on in the pandemic, is a lot of us found ourselves as gatekeepers to misinformation, and that was actually a real surprise. So this call had involved a healthcare research tied to a university, and it was just kind of a surprise that that all of a sudden we were having to find ourselves vet this. We're not talking about medical information, they may have, but we're talking about just sources for reputable news about the pandemic and all that. And in fact, one of my the threat source I cited earlier about 120,000 domains on any given month, 320,000 malicious URLs. That comes from the cybersecurity community. That is, that's part of the secondary threat sharing, threat intelligence. I know one group of people that had their cybersecurity team spawn this project to build up an entire COVID-19 resource page with links to real information, globally. This is, every country had their own site, and their team found themselves just being part of the process to ensure that the correct information was being disseminated out there. So I think that was probably one of those interesting ones, side effects of what we were doing that had to come out, is that all of a sudden we were the gatekeepers to real information. I think the other one that came out, of course, the joke about cybersecurity is it makes things inconvenient, but I think a lot of us found ourselves doing a lot more direct user support than we had been in a while. So it forced us to brush up our polish our people skills, as it were, and just help a lot more people along with the process of dealing with MFA if they were new, or how to handle these the home computers, just get basic hygiene underway. So I think those are the two that stand out to me, is with of course the gateway to real information being the most surprising, and mirrored across several other regions as well.
Okay. And I guess, granted that, I would still expect that there is still a considerable shortage in skills, cybersecurity skills,
Yes.
globally. But I'm even wondering, again, coming out of, the experiences of last year in particular, what might be some important skills, cybersecurity applicants, people who are applying for jobs ought to possess, in order to better ensure their marketability and their suitability for security-related roles.
That's a good one. I would say the first thing, whether you're new to, just out of college, let's say, or high school, and want to get into it, or you're thinking of switching fields or transitioning, I would say is willingness to learn as a start. Accept that there is an infinite number of things you can learn in this space, because let's be honest, probably 80% of them are the techniques we haven't learned about because they haven't been discovered yet from the bad guys, or new and innovative ways to protect an environment. But willingness to learn. I come from a computer science background, which is programming, code development, and I worked my way up from desktop support through servers, communication. So I've got a really broad general IT background. I can't claim to be an expert in any one anymore. Things change all the time, of course. But I think that general IT background has actually made me more effective as a cybersecurity defender now than more thing else. Being able to understand that, if I'm troubleshooting, choose an arbitrary example, email flow, let's say, being able to understand the networking aspects of it, the application level aspects, I think makes me more effective. And would make anyone more effective, being able to understand the big picture, as it were, than being, say, a specialist in. I'm going to pick on a way the industry used to do things. They used to think security was part of the network team, because historically, the security came from the firewall. And the network team ran the firewall. And I've seen this situation arise more often than not, where when security is kind of lumped into the network team, well, what makes up an organization, right? It's a network and computers, endpoints. And if the network team, the person that's doing and investigating an incident, for example, doesn't have the tools or the skills to understand what's running on a Windows computer or a Mac computer or whatever, that makes them significantly less effective at their job. How can they claim to be security if they say, "Oh, this is an endpoint now, I can't do anything about it"? I mean, well, that's where whatever the stats are, I'm going to make it up. And 95% of the threats come from endpoints, because that's the easiest place to compromise. Yeah, so that's what, like my rambling point there was, have a good general IT background, understand a lot of aspects of what makes the organization work. I get that your job may be network or maybe endpoint, or hopefully it's just security, but you better have some understanding of how it works in order to make a better decision or be able to hand off the right information to the right team to get the job done. So if you, for example, you come from an endpoint perspective and you've determined that there's a threat that's making a particular network connection, you need to make sure you can, if you can't look that up directly because of access rights or separation of teams, for example, you can at least communicate what you need clearly to the network team to gather for you. And I think the last point I'd make there on getting into the cybersecurity industry, whatever aspect that is, whether it be a defender like myself or a pen tester or something like that, is coding and scripting. I think programming anything with, let's say, an intermediate level of knowledge. I'm not expecting them to be an app developer, but if that is the case, then there's definitely a niche for you as well. But being able to automate certain functions and do them efficiently and well, and with discipline is really important. Where I'm getting at here, if you're investigating an incident with an organization that's got 1,000 computers, the last thing even 50 computers, let's say anything 50 and bigger, the last thing you want to do is have to go to all 50 computers and type a bunch of commands on it every single time. That's just a waste of your time and slowing down your job. So, if you can learn how to automate that command and run it across 50 computers or more in, under an hour, let's say, then that's, a definite plus in terms of effectiveness. And it teaches you, disciplined coding, teaches you to be consistent, methodical, teaches you to troubleshoot. So it's really a skill that applies itself to a lot of areas, particularly in cybersecurity. So,
Okay.
I think those three would cover it.
Okay, great. And as we begin to wind down, so just have to think about two more questions. Okay, are there any sort of new and emerging threats of which we should be more aware?
That's a pretty broad one.
Yeah.
So, I think I'll answer that one in a slightly roundabout way. The industry has been really good at so the cybersecurity cycle is basically prevent, detect, remediate, or depending on how, I think most vendors have that three-tier process. And let's be honest, we've been really good at threat prevention for a really long time. We're talking about things like firewalls, antivirus, web email filters, things like that. We know about a threat, we see it, we block it, we see a vulnerability, we remediate it, we patch the vulnerability, or we put in a compensating control. The SolarWinds breach, and again, I'm not just picking SolarWinds, but I think most people recognize that they were the big name associated. Turns out there's many things around that, but it's not about the threats we know. It's about the threats we don't know. And what I've been saying to a lot of organizations now is, in light of how many security and technology vendors have been breached and that we know about, of course, there's an infinite number of unknown breaches that haven't been discovered yet, but we need to be focusing our efforts for the next 12, 18, if not longer, if not permanently, let's be honest, is threat hunting. It's about the threats we don't know about yet. So I think, put it this way is, when FireEye disclosed the indicators of compromise, the file hashes, the domains, that was fantastic. That was necessary. The whole world quickly reacted and remediated by putting in blocks of those domains, gave the industry the tools to hunt for those indicators. That's great. But the question now is, what about the next breach like the SolarWinds FireEye? the next time something like that comes out, my question is, how fast can you determine you are at risk or not at risk, let's say? And if you are at risk, how fast can you put in the necessary detection tools and remediation tools? So, I mean, as far as to directly answer your question, there's always going to be the usual phishing, identity theft, things like that. I think right now, the new challenge for the coming foreseeable future is, what do you do about those unknown threats? And it comes down to that triad of prevent, detect, remediate. Prevent and remediate, we know what to do with, right? The moment we know about a threat, we can handle that. It's about detection now. And it kind of coincides nicely with the Caribbean around NIST-based compliance frameworks, because the frameworks, every major framework has a line in there that says you must be logging everything. And that's great. But my point with that is, logging it is easy. You can do that for free and for not much money. The question is, what can you do with it? So if you're logging everything to a free syslog server, fantastic. And if that's all you can afford at the moment, hey, that's better than nothing. But think about if you're a large or medium or larger organization that has that, if you need to backtrack and look through your logs to find out if an admin account was compromised and did X, Y, and Z in your network, consider your effectiveness of manually searching through, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lines of information. It's coming down to, logging is great, but monitoring is better. How are you taking that information and actually using it to your benefit? We put in implemented a logging. I caught myself on that one. A monitoring system with a company recently, and found out that, as a side benefit, they had an application that was no longer authenticating correctly to SQL, and it was actually their core application. And staff retired, things like, there's changeover, things like that happened, but we were able to fix that due to having the right monitoring tools in place. Simply logging it would never been that problem would have never been discovered for quite a while. But like I said, monitoring goes on with that threat hunting, and as a corollary to that, I'd say, practice your incident response procedures. Go through the exercises. We have a new newsletter. We launched a newsletter this year. Every week we sort of throw out there a cybersecurity challenge. So okay, this week's challenge is, can you find, I think last week's was, can you find all your administrator accounts and where they last logged in? You should be able to do that kind of thing. And that's part of the incident response framework. And as it carries on to, in 6 months, 2 months, 6 weeks, whatever, if we see a new breach, how fast can you search your network? How fast can you, look for that threat? I think that's where the focus has to be for the foreseeable future, because it's, like I said, it's no longer about the threats we know we learned about. It's about what we don't, and how fast can we react, or even potentially prevent that. If it's a technique that comes out and you can say, oh no, we implemented the right procedure ahead of time, we don't have to worry about it. That's important. That's where we need to be. That's the ideal.
Okay. Actually, I'm just there. I made a couple of notes because I think I have two more questions to insert before my
Sure.
last question. I guess, you had mentioned the compliance framework earlier on, and you mentioned it again. But I just wanted to confirm, was it something that was only implemented in Cayman, or it was something that had probably a broader application, probably across the region?
Cayman in particular announced middle of last year, give or take, I think it was May, the implementation of the first generation of cybersecurity compliance frameworks that address the technology side of things. Of course, my focus being cybersecurity, I keep calling it that, but it's around governance and policies, procedures. A lot of it is documentation, but I do know that Bermuda has been going down that route as well. Grenada and a few others. I'm trying to think back through Eastern Caribbean. There's not a whole lot in the Western Caribbean other than Cayman, but and I suppose Jamaica is considered West Indies. Sorry, forget sometimes. But so I think most regions are now along that path in some way, and I think it just happened to coincide in many cases with the pandemic. But it's documentation. What are your clear policies? And I think that's where I know speaking to a lot of customers that's been the hardest part, is their formal policies. Like, how do you, in plain English, say that we protect all our endpoints, we keep bad things from happening? How do you say it in a way that satisfies the auditors and the regulators? And that's what really comes out. And so I think it's not necessarily a bad thing that we're having it in a way late in the game. The U.S. and Europe's been doing it for years, but they've also gone through a lot of growing pains on how to make that work. So I think we're actually at a slight advantage in the region right now to be able to implement fairly quickly while taking into account the real aspects and the current challenges with cybersecurity, like supply chain, third-party risk management problems and all that. So, it's new. I don't know. I can't say firsthand about every island's specific area, but I see the effects of it with organizations implementing SIM tools and logging in, being more conscious of. I briefly touched on it a second ago, the third-party risk management. It's like, if you're not familiar with it, think of it like in the U.S. with all the credit reporting bureaus. And you want to get a loan, they go to these credit reporting houses that say, how good are you paying your bills? Do you have any outstanding debt? Things like that. So in the technology space, there's this concept of cyber reputation as well. If you just took on it from a pure public perspective, how reputable, how safe does this domain, does this website, does this organization seem? So we're seeing a lot more of that. Particularly this year, we're seeing it with insurers double checking. Regardless of where an organization or a country sits in terms of compliance frameworks, we see firsthand that insurers and customers and partners are looking at these tools, looking at the cyber reputation of an organization. As well as eventually, and looking, the compliance frameworks look at the internal workings. This is the external, and the idea being is between what you see from the outside and if you're privy to it, what happens on the inside, it gives you, as a consumer of a vendor or a supplier, something like that, an idea of how cyber safe this organization might be. Would you, for example, would you want to bank? Maybe bank's a bad example, but would you want to shop online at a website that's known to steal credit card numbers?
Right.
No, most people logically would say no. But would you want to do business with a company that's known to have lax cybersecurity procedures? Probably not. But like I said, it's something we're seeing more and more leveraged and used by insurers, by customers, and I think we're just going to see that more as well. Increasing over time. The kind of on the compliance, kind of a corollary on that as well is, compliance doesn't necessarily equal security. Compliance just is a framework that says, are you doing what you say you're doing correctly? If you look at, FireEye, yes, I'm sure they were compliant with all the procedures, but there's an example of a major player having a significant breach. But they did everything correctly. They said, okay, we got breached. Here's how we detected it. Here's what you can do to prevent it. And if you look at the value of their company, they're not suffering at all. In fact, they're doing better than ever.
Right.
Because they did everything right. There's no wrong in being. There's nothing. I don't think fundamentally you can ever be faulted for being breached. The question is, did you allow it to happen, like SolarWinds, and they're being crucified in financial terms and media as well because they did a lot of things wrong. They just focus on cost cutting before anything else without thinking through what they were doing. Or if you got breached and you just said, well, we were compliant, that's that. Odds are your customers are not going to be very happy. But if you were breached and you say we detected it within 5 minutes, you had to announce it because maybe that's what your local regulators say. But we caught it, we prevented it, we only lost 12 records, whatever the situation is. That's a good response. And so that kind of goes back to the practice your incident response just like you practice your cybersecurity skills, just like you practice hurricane preparedness. We do that without thinking these days. Yes, we can work remotely. Yes, we have our data. Add the cyber skill set to that, and I think you'll be in a good place.
Right. Right. And then since you mentioned incident response, and I was wondering whether, for example, across the region, I think many countries have sought to establish, at least nationally, some incident response teams. And I wondered whether or not, based on your experience or observation, I don't want to say how effectively are they working, but are they active players? And are they involved in the conversations that have been happening or in the region on security?
I don't think they are as effective or involved as they could be / should be. There's, Caribbean. We know everyone knows everyone. It's a very small community, and I think the trust takes an immense amount of time to develop. And before, trusting, a lot of the incident response teams were born out of government efforts, and no faulting there. I'm just, they are born out of that, and let's say the police departments, things like that. And a lot of times people job hop, and everyone knows everyone. And so, if you know that Jim Smith, made up name, was last week was help desk at a company. Now he's a key person in the incident, financial crimes incident response. It's going to take some trust to accept Jim Smith as being a valid, despite he may have had all the training, or Jane Smith may have had all the training that she needed, but it takes some time to build that up. And the catch-22 is, of course, you also need the experience. So if you can't if they don't have the chance to investigate some of those and respond to those, they can't build up that necessary experience either. I would say that collaboration and sharing is still a big part that is lacking in the Caribbean, and I'm not necessarily sure if we do a lot of sharing within our customer base and with the regulators we work with. I would love to do more sharing. But of course, there's also, inter-country competition as well that comes into play. But it's a tough one. But I think if you find the right group of slightly overlapping, in event, think of it as a regional Venn diagram. If we can build up enough people willing to share, enough groups, organizations willing to share a bit of information here and there, I think we will over time get to where we need to. There was an incident, it wasn't last year, not too long ago, where there was a bank that was hit with ransomware, and they went straight to, due to their proximity to the U.S., it was easier for them to deal with a U.S. provider. I think it was a missed opportunity in a sense to not involve, and I understand it. The bank's just concerned with getting the organization recovered and minimize the impact and customer perception of it. There could be, afterwards, I think anyone that does incident response, they should consider at some point responsibly disclosing what happened. And we've done that before too, where, of course we seek the approval of the victim, of the organization that was impacted, but we do stress that, of course, that it's important to share that information so that we can all prevent it. And I think that's the only way, and that's the best way forward. And that's, like I said, that's what one of our threat intelligence sources that we see. 320,000 URLs, and we implement those blocks with our customers whenever possible. There's other threat sharing sources. It's all, the more we can share, the more we can trust and accept, responsibly that information, the better we'll be regionally. But to directly answer your question about the local certs, as it were, they could be growing. It's a tough one. I recognize the organizational challenges of funding and all that, but you just have to keep plugging at it. It will work over time because we are so interconnected. It just has to.
Right. Okay. And my final question, and I guess, what might be the three key things organizations should be doing in 2021 to improve their security?
Let's see. I think if I combine, readdress those 2 points about threat hunting, to understand that it's about the threats we don't see. I think that's probably the biggest one I would say right now. And any of the points I make, it's not necessarily saying an organization needs to build out an entire security team. I think that's great if you can. Keep in mind, sharing is also important. Sharing is caring, as the old adage goes. These are things that can be done with. They don't have to be expensive. And I think in most cases, you're better off working with a provider that can that has a good reach and diverse customer base as well, because the more diverse, the more organizations talk to each other, and I've mentioned this before, if you have a community of organizations sharing, however that is, intelligence and skills and capabilities, when one gets attacked or impacted, the better the environment becomes. And I think that's key. So roundabout way, they're saying, detection, working, it's about threat hunting and sharing that information. Cyber reputation, like I said, that's a big one. It's becoming more and more important. I think we will see the point where maybe not this year, but I would expect it by next year, realistically, that every bit of compliance framework and tools and insurance and vendors, I think that's going to be an active part of business. I think it's just going to become the norm where, if you want to work with a vendor as a supplier, someone comes approaches you as a customer for financial services or something like that. I think the cyber checks and reputations are going to be an active part of the discussion. And I think regulators are, I know some regulators are starting to look into those as well as using them as active tools. It kind of lends itself towards the supply chain as well. Now's a good time. Start asking your suppliers, your vendors, what are their policies, what are their procedures. You don't have to ask for the inner workings yet, as it's not necessarily required per se, but start asking, start looking at tools that allow you to rate your partners in that sense. And keep in mind, they're not the be and all and end all of security, but they are a measure of how serious, let's say, an organization takes their security. I would say as a bonus tip, if you will, that gets forgotten so often is, we're so used to dealing with software vulnerabilities, Windows and application, a shortcut in identity management. Please don't forget about the firmware, the things you don't think about, things in your printer, the BIOS of your servers, your computers, your network equipment. It's too easy to forget that they're just running for years on the end, but they need updates too. And if you ever were to look around the security advisories around Dell or HP, they all have them. The software that sits in the chips that makes the computer more than a paperweight. You'd be surprised how often there are security vulnerabilities and functional fixes, performance fixes that come out with those. And I think that's, obviously to do that, you have to be able to monitor. If you can't measure it, you can't fix it. So I'll leave that there. But that's an important one that gets forgotten all too often.
That is so true. Yes, just the firmware. And as you said, sometimes, I guess, depending on the age of the equipment, it may not automatically tell you that there's an update, but you
Correct.
probably need to, on a regular basis, check the site to see whether or not there are any, patches or any recommendations in terms of updates that might be needed and to do so.
Yeah, very true. Just a quick side story on that one. I mean, Cisco is the gold standard when it comes to network equipment. Whether you like them or not, everyone knows Cisco is generally a really good technology. Has really good technology, and their certifications, of course, are really important as well. So there's a natural leaning towards Cisco equipment and skills in the Caribbean because they're also eminently marketable and saleable to employers. On the topic of firmware, there is a lot of fake Cisco equipment out there, and which also means there's fake. There's just the chips, but there's also fake firmware. Cisco, there's a whole, I have to Google the news articles, but there have been a recent clampdown and advisories on fake network equipment. And all that applies to right back to the security issue of, okay, if you think you're getting a really good deal on some Cisco use or not, equipment, you might want to double check that it's real, and that also do some due diligence on making sure that's real Cisco, firmware, iOS software running in there. It may not be, and it's not just Cisco. There's a lot of other network companies that are just as prey and just as susceptible to that kind of supply chain breach. I mean, we didn't think this was. We talked about it for years, but didn't necessarily think it was an issue. But SolarWinds proved that it really is, and there's been several along the way as well that are in the same boat. So yeah. Don't forget your firmware.
Yes. Okay, so boy, this has just been an invigorating discussion, somewhat sobering as well, but because I guess you just realize just how much you have to think about. But
Yeah.
it is the price we pay for the conveniences that we enjoy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true.
Sean, just thank you so much for coming back on the
Oh, my pleasure.
podcast. I always have to. Luckily you have been so amenable all of these years, and sometimes you recognize though that it takes a chunk of time to sit down and have these discussions. But I'm so grateful that at least time and time again you are so willing to come back and at least help us to just begin to understand and to oftentimes security tends to fall by the wayside for us users in particular.
Right.
And just to sort of prompt us to not be complacent, even if it's just once a year. But just thank you so much for coming on and giving us an update.
Oh, it was my pleasure.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.